when we do a National Register nomination, it helps protect the property for the future. It's about identifying character, defining features, so that future people in planning, future people making decisions about the property know what to keep. What are the physical features that need to be kept? So a lot of those physical features, of course, have to do with architectural style or design system. But you could also find something eligible for its place in terms of a broad pattern or event of social significance, or if it's associated with a significant person. And in the case of this property, the new City of Mentalphysics, it is eligible under multiple criteria. And so, again, you have these boxes checked here, A, B, and C. Property is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. B is persons, and I'll talk about Dingle. And C is architecture. So every time we find something eligible under one of these, we have to contextualize it. We can't just find something eligible because we said so. We have to write that context, decide what it is, and fit the subject property into that context. So it's a lot of work. This nomination is a draft. It's 230 pages. It's under review right now with the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm assuming they'll be fine with it. They may actually want it a little shorter. 230 pages is a little bit long. I think the reviewer is going to be very frustrated, but hopefully he'll find it interesting, and hopefully you will too. One thing you cannot do in California is or the US for that matter, in honor of separating church and state, you have to be really careful about when you landmark a building that's associated with a religion, because you can't come off as preserving the religion or making the religion significant. So we have a special criterion consideration here. A, we have to acknowledge that this is owned by a religious institution or used for religious purposes. I'll get into that with mental physics. It's a little tricky. So anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because my lecture is going to talk about the events of social significance, the founder, Edwin John Dingle, the architecture, and I will circle back to certain Southern California contexts in which this is significant. So basically, in a nutshell, the new City of Mentalphysics Historic District, which is the name of this property, is associated with Edwin John Dingle, who's later known as Ding Le Mei, and it is a very, very telling property of a larger Southern California context of alternative spiritual disciplines. Southern California seems to have been a haven for such places. And when Dingle established mental physics, there were a lot of them going on. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of those. And then the second half of the presentation will be about the architecture. So I'm going to focus primarily on the architecture in the second half, not the first half. All right? A little site plan here. The district's approximately 150 acres. It's two very, very large parcels. We're dealing with about 60 elements that we had to describe. This is just kind of a general sheet. But what I want to start jumping to is this. This is an aerial from 1963 of mental physics. And I love it. It shows the amphitheater in the middle. This is the Caravansary of Joy, which is what we're in right now, the administration building, and a very, very remarkable plan that's based off a stretched hexagon. This site plan was done by Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, who also did the very building that we are standing in right now. This is the largest collection of Lloyd Wright buildings in his whole body of work. This is the largest, there's 11 buildings here. And there's Edwin John Dingle in the upper left. So I want to talk a little bit about him first. Edwin John Dingle was born in Paddington, England on April 6th, 1881. He was born into a family of printers and journalists, and that's what he's going to undertake for a career early on in his life, and he's going to become very, very highly regarded for it. He has kind of a complicated childhood. His mother died at birth, and his father died when he was 9. So he's essentially an orphan. He's raised by his grandmother, and then a little bit later, an uncle. And his uncle's also a printer, and they sort of bring him into the family trade very young. By the time he's 13, he's doing internships for papers, small papers, in England. By the time he's about 20, he's a West Indies correspondent for various London daily papers. He's headed over to Jamaica regularly and covering news there. And in 1904, he was always fascinated with China, always fascinated with the East, as something very exotic. He lands a job, he's only 23, at the Singapore Straits Times in Singapore, which is a newspaper that's still around. And they hired him as a manager. And during this time, he oversaw the advertising department. He was really, really, really good at marketing, and that's going to show up later also with mental physics. So by 1906, he was the superintendent and manager of the printing department. And while he's in China, he starts to take these treks. And some of these treks are rather long. He walks, we don't know the exact figure, but it's at least 900 miles of China on foot. He's walking across China on foot for a minimum of 900 miles. He claimed more, but 900 miles is fine. Doesn't have to stretch that. So there he is in 1909. As he traverses China, he's documenting the heck out of everything there. And the Institute, the Joshua Tree Retreat Center, has in their possession these remarkable glass slides that belong to Mr. Dingle. And I have a few of them here that I had scanned when I was working on the nomination. And he writes a book about his China trek called Across China on Foot. This is published around 1912, I believe, give or take. And he has these very detailed diagrams about where he went. He's very detailed about what he saw, where he went, day by day, moment by moment. And he's one of the first Westerners to do this. He's very, very early to the game to go to China and to document it in detail, to have a book that gets published this way. He does, this is of his walk, and he ends in Bamo, which is Burma, Myanmar today, and does this trek through Yunnan mainly, and walks through Yunnan, that would be westward to what's today Myanmar, documents it, has all of these images in it. And being a journalist that he is, living in China, and by then living in Hangzhou about 1911, he was or a little bit earlier, he was in a town called, today it's called Dongchuan. He got really, really sick for a while and stayed with a couple. He dedicated the book to them. He said that you guys saved my life. This book is for you. I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you. Anyway, there he is in 1911, covering the Chinese Revolution. These are articles that he wrote that were in U.S. publications. Regular good old U.S. newspapers had Dingle as sort of a syndicated correspondent covering the Chinese Revolution in person. These are his photographs of various scenes of the Chinese Revolution. So what he's doing is quite a contribution very, very early. I mean, he would be a significant figure even if he didn't start mental physics. He married in 1912 a woman named Dr. Lillian Grandin, who's also a really, really significant missionary doctor in China. She has her own postage stamp in England. Not only is he a journalist, he starts in 1913 what's called the Far Eastern Geographical Establishment. And through this enterprise, he would create one of the first major maps of China for the West. And it was called the New Map of China. It was published in 1914 with revised editions over the following 2 years. He was a friend and confidant of Li Yonghong, who was directly under Sun Yat-sen, and he was the future president of the Republic of China. So Dingle's pretty connected in this world, and they think that the undertaking of this mapping may have been done with Yonghong's blessing. So in a little bit later, in 1917, having done this map, it's not enough for him to do a map. He decides to do a whole atlas and commercial gazetteer for China. This is a substantial atlas. This was considered the first major business and commerce atlas for China, accepted by the Western world, and it was sort of the standard atlas for this until World War II. So there's some images here from it, it's just really, really detailed. Here's a whole page about China's tea trade, railway maps of China, detail upon detail. Just to jump back here, during that same time, he starts a publication called China, Far East Finance and Commerce. And this is the sort of precursor publication of the Far Eastern Economic Review, which was a major China publication up through, I think it went out about 2003. So Dingle in China is a journalist, and he's very connected to this world and understanding business. By 1921, in 1918, he arrives in New York, he leaves Asia, and his wife, Lillian Grandin, returned to England. That's about when they split up. She would pass away in China a few years later. She was only 47. And in 1919, Dingle was made joint editor of the China Far East Finance and Commerce, which I had showed you a moment ago. The Far Eastern Economic Review was around until 2009. He's credible. He's the real thing in terms of his China knowledge. Okay, so he comes to New York about 1918. And by 1921, he moves to California. He moves to Oakland. And this is a really interesting time for Dingle. He's still writing articles. There's all kinds of articles of his online from this era. But he seems to have gone through some sort of metamorphosis. He seems to have become a little more reclusive. He's with his second wife and their two children, Edward Jr. and Richard. This is just a census from 1930 showing the family in Oakland. Him and his kids. This is the kind of research we do for these National Register nominations. And he had a lot of ailments from China. He almost died there. And then he had a really bad eye problem even when he came back to the United States. He had a really bad eye problem. He had other ailments. When he was in China, he claims that he learned a variety of Eastern healing techniques, particularly a lot of them around breath. And he starts practicing these upon himself. He is in Oakland, and he claims that the practice of these Eastern techniques healed him, that he recovered. And, this was a sort of a transformative time for him. It seems like maybe he was a little bit burned out. He was definitely ambitious. He had already accomplished a lot. He moves to Oakland. My understanding is there was a lot of downtime for him. He just needed to kind of seclude a little bit. And he had young kids to raise also. Here are some more glass slides of him. We think this is probably in Oakland, of him doing these breathing exercises. So a lot of these are, if you're familiar with pranayama breathing exercises, a lot of what he's interested in is pranayama. Some of it comes from various Upanishad texts. And he combines this with various dietary restrictions, meditation. This is the 20s. He's very, very early to this game. And from this, ultimately establishes in New York what's called the science of mental physics. So it originally gets established in New York. By the late 1920s, he is lecturing in New York at Steinway Hall, and he's getting a lot of press. He changes this is when he takes on the persona of this healer with Eastern knowledge known as Ding Le Mei. So you have Dingle, D-I-N-G-L-E, becoming Ding Le Mei. It's a little bit of a bump over of a hyphen, and he's Ding Le Mei. It's this sort of new persona. And you had a lot of these new persona types during this early era, too, of people sort of taking on a persona. It seems to be a way to get people interested in what they had to say, and you know, get them interested in these teaching practices, which seem to have helped him a lot. I love the headline of the one here on the left: "Savant discovers breath important to human life." Well, it's true. Breath is pretty important. So these are just various articles from about the late 20s, early 1930s. So I want to talk a little bit about what mental physics is. You know, and there's people in this room who have been practicing it, who know it way better than I do. I'm just going to give you a very basic summary here. I came across various texts that have various points, about 5 or 6 points about, you know, what are our primary points of this. And the first point is, quote unquote, to proclaim and teach the eternal truth of life and to spread the light of divine wisdom working through natural law and the holy trinity of body, mind, and spirit of man. And indeed, there are a lot of triangles all over the place the closer you look at mental physics. He did not perceive this so much as a religion, but more as a teaching discipline. So it straddles in his mind two things, you know, but it's primarily teaching. But it gets incorporated in California as an educational and a teaching discipline. It marketed itself as a quote-unquote highly specialized school, making available to all who desire to learn the fundamental teaching of all great spiritual scientists and teachers of the ages. So it wanted to make available sacred knowledge. The idea here was to enlighten those who seek understanding of divine law and who wish to assist in spreading the light of divine wisdom, to help in the regeneration of the human race and to make the earth a veritable heaven populated by the new race in the new age. And that language about new age becomes really important because in my efforts to not landmark this as a religion, because I can't, I made an argument that a lot of what Dingle was interested in informs Southern California New Age culture, which is definitely a part of the Southern California experience of meditation, of diet, of breathing exercises, of yoga. He's interested in all of this. And he's very, very early in the region for being interested in all of these things. Anyway, he comes to LA for the first time in 1931. This is about August 30th. And he lectures at Trinity Auditorium, which is still there on Grand and 9th. It's abandoned, but this was a big lecture and concert venue. This is the article of his very first visit to Los Angeles. And by this point, he is a pretty known geographer. As a cartographer, he's admitted into the Royal Society of Geographers in England. But he's obviously interested in talking about some of these other things more akin to like what we see here about demanding youth and success and about your thoughts. And as such, he fits into a larger context about alternative spiritual disciplines in Southern California. Now, Southern California was not where this idea of accepting all these great religions started. In 1893, there was in Chicago, there was the World's Parliament of Religions at the 1893 World's Fair. Some of you may know about that. There was a book written about it. And here, this sort of event is credited with making Americans more open and tolerant to other faiths. This is kind of where this was the first bold move to bring people in to see what Buddhism is about or see what Hinduism is about. But Southern California is where it really, really begins to flower. And even though a lot of these theosophy, which I have the symbol of up there, begins in New England, by Helena Blavatsky. It finds a home in Southern California under Annie Besant, and then also at Point Loma. There were two branches of it here. Here's Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was raised by Annie Besant to be sort of a new messianic figure in Theosophy. Theosophy is credited with really sort of bringing, among other things, Buddhism to Southern California, and Buddhism really to the United States, and really like fostering an appreciation of that. And Theosophy in its mission statement is, very, very open. Its mission is to encourage open-minded inquiry into world religions, philosophy, science, and the arts in order to understand the wisdom of the ages, respect the unity of all life, and help people explore spiritual self-transformation, about the self. And then, of course, Paramahamsa Yogananda for Self-Realization Fellowship, and he is very much credited with bringing yoga to the United States. Gave talks on it to huge audiences starting in 1920, and by the mid-1920s, he too is based here in Southern California. So Dingle is not the first. He fits into a larger milieu of this tolerance of East meets West, coupled in his case with what's called New Thought. And sort of the primary figure of the New Thought movement is over there on the left. It's Phineas Quimby. Phineas Quimby was originally from Maine and believed that disease was caused by erroneous thought and that diseases could be cured through the power of the mind, specifically through positive thinking, attitude, and affirmation, and what might better be known today as visualization. So a lot of what Dingle is going to appropriate from is East meets West and New Thought, and that's a lot of what mental physics is. And that brings, of course, up Ernest Holmes here, who, like Dingle, started a New Thought-based movement, in this case, the Science of Mind, or what's the Church of Religious Sciences it was long known as, and today they have various centers for spiritual living. And Holmes started his sort of New Thought-based movement here in Southern California. Gave his first lectures at the Abel Club on Wilshire, and started his practice 6 months before Dingle. So Dingle must have been aware of him because the two, in some ways, are extremely, extremely similar. In a certain manner of being open to affirmative prayer and spiritual mind treatment, and borrowing from this desire to have East meets West and approaching spirituality as a science. The science of mental physics and the science of mind. A lot of these esoteric practitioners in the 20s are trying to link these esoteric practices with science, and that includes Dingle. The word science gets used a lot. So Dingle himself comes out here, incorporates 7 years to the day, November 7th, 1934. He incorporates the Institute of Mentalphysics still AKA Science of Mental Physics. Gets this headquarters here in Koreatown, in the Koreatown neighborhood of LA. This was a recently abandoned church from 1913 for a Methodist church that had moved down up to Wilshire Avenue. And this remains the headquarters for mental physics up through the 70s. Where we are is kind of the Exarch, or the retreat center, but the headquarters was on 213 South Hobart, right there. Dingle bought this property for $170,000. And being the printer that Dingle is, being the writer that he is, and he's a voluminous, he writes a lot, he starts to put out publications related to his newly established mental physics. Here's volume 1, number 1 of what's called the Lamplighter, and you can see some of his interests here: memory, developing breath, your own chemical type, a radio talk on Tibet, Tibet plays into the mythology of mental physics quite a lot. Dingle states that he spent quite a lot of time there. He definitely uses a lot of Tibetan teachings in his own practice. He definitely was in Yunnan, which is close to Tibet. He may have been acquainted with Tibetan monasteries, but as of right now, we don't have any concrete evidence that he never went into the Tibet Autonomous Region that we're aware of. But he was close, and he was in the definite vicinity, and he was very, very interested in Tibet. He starts this sort of, I don't know what to call it, mythology around inner versus outer. Inner chamber teachings versus something that's a little more approachable. He refers to his headquarters as the first church of mystic Christianity. A lot of these people merging East and West, they're still keeping the West. They still keep reference to Christianity. They're not negating Christianity, but they seem to be more interested in the more esoteric stuff of the East, and they kind of use Christianity as a way to get people there, and then as a springboard to get them interested in some of the other more esoteric teachings. So in mental physics, there are inner chamber teachings. There's a lot of talk here about youth, about health. A lot of people were moving to California from points east for their health at the turn of the century. This has been documented quite well. There's whole books about it. And from 1890 to 1920, the population of California increased 530%. 530%. According to Kerry McWilliams, a historian from the 1940s, who wrote a really great book about Southern California called Island on Land, in the 40s, there were 200,000 people who considered themselves recently immigrated or not homeless, but like they were still kind of like newly arrived. The whole point is that there were a lot of newly arrived people to Southern California during this time. And Southern California did not present the same sort of planning layout as like smaller towns where life is centered along a main street and you have your church right there. This was much more spread out, much more horizontal. People did not oftentimes move here to be part of something old. They often moved out here for this new climate, which allowed them to live wherever they wanted, and insofar as they could afford it. And aesthetics became a bigger concern than, well, I got to live near my church, or I got to live near a main street. So what this means, according to some writers, is that once a lot of these new folks arrive here in Southern California during this time, the culture that an organized religion sort of puts on you doesn't have the same stronghold, in part because you're more geographically spread out. You're new here, it's very horizontal, it's not small, it's a whole new sort of anonymous environment, and that seems to have allowed for more of these kind of places to sort of develop, and for an openness and a tolerance to some of these other more esoteric spiritual aspects that I've been mentioning. And it's part of the reason why Southern California is considered to have so many of them, and it's probably part of the reason why Dingle himself eventually moved here. Here's just some of the literature I've come across. This stuff is remarkable. I mean, he's very, very good at design and graphics, and here's a page from one of the teaching manuals on triangle breath, and that's Dingle. Here's a giant fold-out poster I found for the Guide to Correct Diet, Health, Happiness, and Beauty. And it's all based off bodily chemical types. And a lot of very, very specific instructions on how to meditate and breathing exercises. This is a big part of Dingle's teachings. Around this time, in the mid-1930s, here's just a couple more about thought as an electric force, so that kind of goes back to some of the new thought. This book I found here on breathing your way to youth. your mind and its mysteries, and even constipation, which he really hates. He really hates constipation. He called it the great American evil. He really, really hates constipation. And records. So you could get some 78 records of memory breath, the voice of Ding Le Mei. And in 1937, 35, give or take, the Institute started a mail, they really got focused on mail and sort of postal correspondence classes. And their membership seems to have really, really ascended during that time. It grew by the thousands. And Dingle was a very, very good marketer. He knew how to make materials that were attractive, good looking. He was a very sort of persuasive writer. And he seems to have really cared about, he was really, really in depth with his knowledge of these breathing exercises and meditation and detailed diet aspects. And he must have done pretty well, because suddenly now that brings us here. And in 1941, he decided he wanted to build a new city. And here we are. And so on August, he said, that is my dream. As I can think of the kingdom of heaven within me, so I can think of a city, and many cities, outside us and round us, where truth and beauty and fair play and love shall inform the square upon which we may build one city and then another, and so on without end. He was thinking big. So a lot of this sort of, new thought, new thought today kind of exists as kind of abundance thinking or prosperity gospel, or, if you think about Deepak Chopra or Terry Cole Whitaker, or even somebody like Schuller, who was into prosperity gospel. It's kind of what became of New Thought. In Dingle's time, it was more for health, about thinking a certain way, saying affirmations to yourself for your health. It wasn't necessarily, getting rich wasn't the primary point of all of this. Anyway, in 1941, he became a U.S. citizen. And on August of 23rd of that year, at a sunrise ceremony, he consecrated the very land upon which we are all on right now. And this was to be known as the new City of Mentalphysics. This is a site plan by Lloyd Wright. And I want to point out a detail here that's probably not at all obvious. This is 29 Palms Highway. This is us right here. I think this is the Administration Building, Caravansary of Joy. This, on the other side of the street, was also going to be the new City of Mentalphysics, that way. This was all supposed to be the new city. And as part of this new city, he was going to have elementary school, auto repair shop, some of these items which are a little more practical, they're all kind of listed down here. A little bit hard to read on the slide, admittedly. And then here's another work and I got to mention this too, before we get to that. Lloyd Wright did a bunch of buildings designed for this that were never made. One of them is called the Fountain of Gratitude Water Source, the Abode of Breath Garden, the Manor of Silence Chancellor's House, the Temple of Reverence, and then finally the Caravansary of Joy Service Center, which did get made and we're standing inside it. And this is a really remarkable diagram because all of those were, I believe, these were all Joshua trees that existed. So the idea was to keep the Joshua trees. Dingle loved nature. He loved it out here. And a lot of his later literature touts this area. Here is Lloyd Wright's plan that kind of basically did get made. It's the one I showed you in the picture, this sort of stretched hexagon. This is the Caravansary of Joy, the administration building, which is also known as Ding Le Mei's house. The cottages, which we'll look at, the cafeteria. This was never made, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Indeed, this was early on intended to be a new city. There was a farm here called the Agricultural Experiment Station, where Dingle wanted to grow crops for the people who would be here. And it actually was a functioning farm for quite a while. It grew apricots, nuts. It did quite well through the late 70s, and my understanding is there was a problem with the county about the well, and they got bureaucratic and no more greenery. But this is a 1972 topographic map here from the USGS, and this green here means orchard. So there were plants growing here at least in 1972. Here's our buildings right here. This is a road, and what's really interesting about this road is a lot of the rock work in these very buildings was quarried from this hill. And so there's the road leading to the prospect right up there. So there was a well. These are hitching posts for the horses, those sort of pylon-looking things. A maintenance area. In this, I'm only showing this kind of a draft slide, but these were buildings that were among the first buildings done. And again, it points to the fact that he was thinking big, trying to set the infrastructure up. That's just the diagram from the nomination. A water tank was built in 1948. This is some mysterious tank support structure, but I love the design of it. The garage. But he lays down that stuff first. And this idea of planning a whole city also falls into a context that I'll mention really quickly for Southern California of utopian colonies. According to the author Robert Hine, who's written a lot on utopias in California, from 1850 to 1950, California had more utopian colonies than any other state. And most of them, of course, did not work out. This is Crotona, to go back to the Theosophists. A lot of this was built in Hollywood, in Beechwood Canyon. It was meant to be kind of this place to focus on the arts, the classics. You know, it's based off some earlier Greek information. Llano del Rio, which was a socialist colony near Pear Blossom Highway in Palmdale. There's the remains of that. The Little Landers. So some of them were more esoteric, some of them were more political. This was a utopian colony based off each person getting X amount of dollars to run an acre, and if you gave each man an acre of land, and he could take care of his family and sort of be close to the city, but not have to work so much. It was a little socialist in a way. These were all just a lot of these were just very idealistic and didn't go anywhere. And, you know, this never became a city either, so this sort of does fit into that milieu. I just found out really recently that these cottages were, we thought these were worker cottages, and these are among the earliest buildings here at Mental Physics. They're right over there. These were actually done by a name architect from Palm Springs named Charles Dubois, who some of you who are familiar with modernism may know. He became really, really big in the mid-century modern era. These appear to be very early works for him. A little bit of mission quality to them. With the parapet, these sort of like pipe openings, kind of standard. But Dingle perceived these as housing for his workers, but also early, right after he consecrated the property, guests could also stay here too. One of the buildings that looks more like a standard house shows up in early plans as the clubhouse. It was meant for fun. Then we get to this. Now we're going to talk a little more about Lloyd Wright. So this is the Caravansary of Joy at the top. And this is the administration building. There are two of the cottages from Dubois, and one of them you can see is integrated right into the administration building. He had Lloyd Wright sort of recycle the building right into that. The Mansion Builder is another publication that Dingle established to help sort of raise funds for doing all of this. These are appeals, but they're beautifully done. I mean, just gorgeous graphics. The Caravansary and the admin building are done by 1947. They're actually finished at the end of 1947. A little bit about Lloyd Wright. He was born in Illinois, lived, of course, everybody knows his father, Frank Lloyd Wright. Lloyd Wright is really hard to research online, by the way, because if you type in Lloyd Wright, you get his dad every time. So he was really hard to find on Google because he has the identical name. So these are some early works from Lloyd Wright here in Southern California. Some of you may know them. This is the Soden House in Los Feliz. Some of you maybe know about the Black Dahlia and all that, and there's a chapter of that that has to do with this. Wayfarer's Chapel in Palos Verdes, which he's designing at the exact same time that he's doing mental physics, and it has many of the same angles, these 120-degree angles, 30-degree angles, 60-degree angles, and the Hollywood Bowl. Lloyd Wright did the early Hollywood Bowl bandstands. And the one that's up now, or the one that we're familiar with, was done by a group called Allied Architects in the 20s. It was recently replaced in '03, but it's identical. Lloyd Wright came up with that design, and this was his earlier version of that. So he's established here, moves here. He had studied with the Olmsted and Olmsted landscape firm, so he's really interested in landscape, and he appears to have done the original landscaping here, a lot of it. He was involved in the 1915 Pan-Pacific exhibition in San Diego. If any of you have ever been to Balboa Park, he worked with the Olmsted brothers out there. And he was a set designer for Paramount Pictures. And this becomes kind of an important fact because a lot of these buildings seem to have kind of a stage set quality to them. And it seems like that's where he kind of first sort of picked up on that. He actually worked on the 1922 film Robin Hood, starring Douglas Fairbanks, and at that time, the castle that Lloyd Wright designed for that was believed to be one of the largest film sets ever made. So here's a plan for the caravansary building, and one thing you notice right away is there's not a lot of right angles. There's a lot of obliques. There's a lot of odd angles in here. He was very interested in this idea of the diagonal for these new types of flowing spaces that he thought it could afford. He was interested in how you see it with honeycombs, in geodes, in crystals. Father and son at this time are both interested in oblique angles. And in part this is because all of these European modernists are doing right angles. And Frank Lloyd Wright has kind of an adversity to a lot of those European modernists. Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier. Frank Lloyd Wright's kind of a rebel against a lot of that, and so is his son. They are both rebelling against a lot of the modernism that a lot of us may be familiar with. Typical international style modernism. And they're interested in exploring this new way of approaching these spaces. Frank Lloyd Wright had a building called the Hannah Honeycomb House in Palo Alto. It was based off hexagons, which of course the son kind of copies. I think this is actually a hexagonal space right here, now that I look at it. I think it is. And a reaction against that typical modernism. Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't want to sort of just follow the mold, in terms of what other modernists are doing. Another thing that's interesting about this is here where the swimming pool is, that was originally going to be a tennis court. There's the pool right there. It too was going to be a hexagon. And that was going to be a croquet and bowling green up there. So this was kind of meant as a place for fun. This was almost like some sort of retreat center or getaway at the time. Ding Le Mei, Dingle, originally approached Frank Lloyd Wright about doing this. And Frank Lloyd Wright was like, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not dealing with you. Gave it to his son right away. Didn't want to deal with Dingle at all. And so Lloyd Wright ended up doing this. And here's the outside of it. Some of you are parked right in front of this. These very interesting sort of pylons. This is what Frank Lloyd Wright called desert masonry, and what Lloyd Wright refers to as desert masonry also. Rock, stone that is of the land that you are building on, that the building feels really integrated with its land. And sure enough, in this case, a lot of this stone is from that hill right over there, just right behind us. These long poles that you see here, these beams, I was very curious about these when I came. I thought, what's the purpose of these? What do they do? They're cool looking, But it turns out that these beams originally had a giant tule mat on them, tule, like a reed. This supported a giant reed, like fascia of reed, and it provided sun. The reed did. I don't think that it lasted too long. I don't see too many pictures with it, though I see some. Here's the original site coloring plan for this. This is going to be that big reed. You know, it's flat, like a box fascia almost. And Lloyd Wright wanted this to be purple and blue. So it was going to be bright purple and blue. And just imagine coming up on this and having the main visual element be purple and blue with the orange and pink walls. It's a lot of color. Very, very ambitious with color in a way that a lot of more traditional modernists, you know, would not. They were against color. They didn't want a lot of it. I mean, the Bauhaus would have bumps of color, but it wasn't all about color. So the Wrights, father and son, are going full bore into color here. Here's some promotional literature from Dingle during this time, just showing how much he loved nature. So that's his writing. It's still as the peaceful walks of ancient night. One touch of nature, another whole world known. I can't read it. But there's his wife, there's him, there's that reed mat. And they ended up not doing the purple and blue. I think it's just simple reed mat, but you can see it there. Interspersed with scenes of the desert. There's the reed mat right there. There's some of it's exposed. There it is again. And the building is very, very, of course, integrated with nature. There's some promotional literature of Ding Le Mei inspecting the magnificent stonework. And there's the magnificent stonework. And I want to just talk a little bit about organic architecture. In describing Taliesin West, which is a better-known work done by Frank Lloyd Wright Sr., the architectural Ellen has discussed how, quote-unquote, battered piers of concrete and desert stone created a low visual center of gravity, a stable base settled firmly on the earth to support the light wooden canvas canopies that sheltered the indoors. Wright's columns summoned up no memory of classical ornament. Carrying broad eaves extending over the land, they were protective, intended to make man feel at home. They were the essence of shelter. A lot of those qualities are here also. And sure enough, if you compare Taliesin West by Frank Lloyd Wright at the top with the caravansary, they're very, very similar. You have the same desert masonry. It's almost the same color. You have the same integration of this masonry coming inside, so this is just in the other room. You have these fins in the wood in the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then in stone in the case of Lloyd Wright. So these buildings are very, very similar. This is all known as what's called organic architecture. And the original ideas of organic architecture were published by Lloyd Wright in this Architectural Record article from about 1914. And the idea is not to, the term for organic architecture now has kind of changed, but originally it just meant that there was an all-over cohesion and materials are not covered up or disguised as anything else other than themselves. So you don't cover up the stone, you don't cover up the wood. And the idea was that this was, the ideal of organic nature was to be the guide for organic architecture, and integrity in architecture was whatever natively fit into the setting regardless of any preconceived notions of style. So the idea with organic architecture is to make it fit, make it integrated with the land, not cover up the materials, and an all-over cohesion. It is as if a given building is a single organism, like a lizard or some creature, right, with distinct repeating elements akin to discs on a spine. We see that with the fins here at the caravansary. And then the administration building, done at the same time by Lloyd Wright, also using many of those same elements, the native stone, this long, low-slung character, the pylons, which are not, typical classical pylons. There's the rendering for it. It's a little bit faint. But you could see this wonderful sense of, just a beautiful palette, diagonals, trying not to just blindly copy something modernist, and also trying to integrate this into its land. This is long, low land here where this is, and the idea is to make it seem like it's growing right out of it. And indeed, if you look at the color of this soil, the color of this, it's very, very similar. It's not counter to that at all. And Dingle initially, this is the back of the administration building. He initially gave all these nighttime speaking engagements there under a full moon. So it was all about speaking outside. So that's in the back of that. There's these mysterious red triangles and circles painted on these steps. I have no idea what they are. I'm guessing he probably put them there, but I don't know for sure. Maybe not. But nonetheless, there he is speaking. The text is quite funny. It's too bad it's not more legible here, but that's fine. I just mainly wanted to show you that this was originally meant as a gathering place back there for his lectures. And there he is inside here. I mean, how can we not include this? Because this is kind of what's happening right now. So here he is speaking in Friendship Hall. He would teach breathing exercises in here. There's video footage of people doing various breath work, deep breathing. I've done a little bit of it. I've had the honor of working with Evelyn and Frank Haggard, who taught me. We did a little bit one time, and it was just absolutely wonderful. So thank you, and thank you for being here. Okay. By about 1950, Dingle realized he wasn't going to get into a city. So this basically becomes a place for people to have conventions and retreats and to learn. It's a teaching center away from the city. So starting in 1950, he has all of this literature about his conventions here at the new City of Mentalphysics, or the Institute of Mentalphysics. So the first convention occurs in 1950. And conventions continued on site at least until 1980, when a local newspaper article announced the 128th Mentalphysics Convention. There's a lot of conventions. But that's because, for example, in 1961, monthly conventions were held April through June, and then in September and October. The 1961 conventions each had a theme. They included blessings, concentration, roses, oleanders, and sunsets. So you would go out here and have a theme, have a convention, hang out. Here's a later convention from September of 1962. And sort of going back to what I said earlier about that Los Angeles context, about a lot of people moving here from other points eastward for health. There was a lot of interesting, including with Dingle, an interest in health connected to youth, or somehow maintaining youth. And a lot of the practitioners, even though this is very esoteric, your practitioners are not, what you would expect as like countercultural people. Often it's very Protestant, it's very Midwestern, and a lot of his groups, especially even back then, tend to skew a little older. So these folks here are, if you see these folks on the street, they just look like pretty typical people, and yet they're coming out here and they're learning all this esoteric knowledge, and they're open to it. That was one of the beautiful things about Southern California, is you could have somebody who just looks like a typical person, and then you start talking to them and they're telling you about pranayama and all this, and it just allowed for that. So even though Southern California had a context of a lot of alternative possibilities, you would never know looking at the person from the outside, and that's kind of a wonderful thing. It's not obvious back then. So at these conventions, these also become places for kind of fun. Here's Dingle on a horse. He loved horses. There was his wife and his daughter. And this little building here, which I think now is used for massages, that was originally his horse stable. So that's near the maintenance area right behind us. And here he is on a horse, but he has this very, very ambitious, what does this say? The day will come when upon this land there will be our majestic temple, our college, our school for orphan children. Remember, he was an orphan. Happy homes and laughing faces and much else. Mankind's needs must be regenerated, emancipated, brought into true spiritual freedom. Come, let us accomplish the impossible by true and faithful cooperation. So he's always pushing for what can be. Try that new thought idea of just visualizing what can be. And then we get to jump back to Lloyd Wright here. So by the time these are made, this is already conventions. This is the cafeteria from about 1956. Lloyd Wright's buildings from this era have sort of these flared, extended, tapered edges. They're like very dramatic in a way that Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings would have never been. These are a little more overtly dramatic, probably from that stage set background. UCLA just gave me all of these fantastic renderings. Again, a lot of 120-degree angles, a lot of 60-degree angles, 30-degree angles. I think the roof itself is if I remember right, 60-degree angle. Or the two roofs, I don't have the image in here. Here it is, right here. It's a 120-degree angle. So there's the roof plan. Not a box. This is in the mid-50s. So many people were just doing boxes. You know, that was the uniform, orthodox thing to do. And Lloyd Wright is coming out here and making these buildings that kind of extend out horizontally like the land itself. And so there's the cafeteria. There's a sectional view. There's the plan. This roof is just like completely over the top. There's the roof in the plan there. And that's very, very bold. He is dealing with some very, very bold forms. There's some people enjoying the cafeteria. This is a picture of our architecturally remarkable dining room in Capitals, modern in every respect. Conventioners all smiling at the camera. These interesting folks here getting their meal. But you look at those lines. These trellises that you see along the edge, these are really interesting. They're intended to allow light in while also blocking it from certain angles, almost like if you're putting down a sun visor. So it allows some light in, but also is intended to kind of block it. These staggered course ends here are very ubiquitous throughout his work. This dual colored brickwork, and it's the same material on the outside as it is on the inside. A generous use of glass to integrate the indoors and the outdoors. This is a markup for the amphitheater that's out there that Lloyd Wright also did. I'm not going to talk too much about the amphitheater to say that it was done in 1955. And it's done by the same architect who did the Hollywood Bowl. So it's kind of something you may not have expected when you first saw the amphitheater. Here's the plans for some of the triplex cottages. He did 8 cottage buildings here, duplexes and triplexes. Again, with this sort of extended chevron shape that he not only uses here, but he uses upon a bunch of other contemporaneous works that he's doing in the mid-50s. I think Wayfarers has a couple. The Taggart House, I think, is the name of the other one. So we see this vocabulary in Lloyd's other works of this time. We can contextualize these against those other works. They are of the same family. Here's his rendering for the cottage. Again, look at the original color scheme intended for that. So the walls are kind of a pink, and then the roof as a blue-purple. And I thought this was just him being fantastical, but because you have a blue-purple called out on the caravansary, he probably intended it for the cottage as well, a blue-purple roof. And then there's another drawing of it, sort of an elongated perspective. But they seem elongated just as they are, regardless of the drawing. This is a duplex. Again, closely integrated into the land. Here's a distant shot. They look like they're just growing right out of the ground. And Dingle loved nature, Lloyd Wright loved nature. They had that in common. And this idea of mental physics as a retreat center, as a getaway for spiritualists of some form, also has a context in California that I won't go into in detail, but some of you may know about the Lake Shrine by Paramahansa Yogananda. This is in Palisades. When he got this in 1950, this was considered way out yonder by the coast off Sunset. And this is the Robert Stacy Judd designs for Crotona, Ojai. They built in Hollywood and eventually they moved to Ojai. They see Hollywood as too corrupt. They go to Ojai and they do that. They start in Ojai in the 1920s. So this fits into that too, where mental physics is headquartered in LA, but there's this spiritualist retreat center that's elsewhere from the headquarters. And so we have examples of that as well. Part of the nomination was to find and call out and recognize details that some may not pick up on right away, because these are the important things to keep for the future. You know, obviously the overall form is important, but a lot of times if you lose these small ephemeral details, you lose the more subtle aspects that give you a sense of time, even if they're not pretty on the surface. So Dingle was very, very proud of his parking lot, his parking space here. As you come in, you have that long area with these triangular planters. He claimed it held 2,000 cars. Lloyd Wright designed it. It's on all of Lloyd Wright's designs. There's these triangular planters. They're made out of concrete masonry block with staggered coarse ends like we see in the cafeteria. And all they need is maintenance. I mean, the material is still there. You just maintain them and you don't have to replace them or redesign them. And the other thing that's great about these, think about this driving down 29 Palms Highway. These originally had 3 Italian cypresses sticking out of each one. There's 13 of them. The triangles are in an up-down formation. And imagine driving down the road and seeing these Italian cypresses in triangles as you go. That was the idea of each of these, that they all had Italian cypresses. The verticals of those cypresses would counterpoint or counterbalance this long horizontal span. So all of that was thought out. This pipe column on the cafeteria, you know, the fact that this still exists is kind of amazing. I mean, this is just a very utilitarian feature that was used a lot in the 50s, but modernism was utilitarian. You know, that was a big point of modernism. And then I love this incinerator here over by the administration building. That's a Lloyd Wright designed incinerator. So small details. God is in the details, right? So, you know, it's about, so this nomination is not just about the big things, but it's about understanding and really enjoying and appreciating those vignettes that tell a very ephemeral story of another time, of things that we may not think about when we think about the 1950s, but then we're like, oh, wait a minute, when's the last time I saw one of those? Or, you know, this used to be everywhere, now it's gone. You know, and there were parts of this that were utilitarian. I did the landmark nomination for the Integratron also. And one of the things I really liked about that was Van Tassel originally just had a chain link fence around it. It was really, really basic. I think what they've done with it is very beautiful. They have very good people there. It's impressive work. But I was also very interested in that sort of utilitarian approach to a lot of this. Things that are gone. This used to be the sign at the entry. It was a gigantic pyramid with mental physics in neon. It's gone. They ride in the road. To go back to this, the original entry was over here. So the original, I have to document things that have changed. So the original entry was over here into the admin building, and now it's somewhere, it's right here in the middle. You can even see the pyramid right there. Somehow that pyramid is showing, which is a little kind of intense, I guess, in a sort of maybe as a sign of something. But there's the original entrance. That's moved. Some things have changed. You know, it's not, there's some changes. They widened the road and got rid of the pyramid. Then we get into the things that were never made. This was going to be the Temple of Reverence, this giant chapel that was going to be built on the other side with this almost like cascading waterfall thing. That's right out of a movie. That is just completely over the top. This was going to be the original preceptory building. A preceptory means a quote-unquote a provincial community or religious house of medieval Knights Templars subordinate to the London Temple. So he's borrowing language from other older esoterica. So this never was made. Part of the reason why these things were never made is Dingle was running out of money to pay Lloyd Wright. So he's asking for money here in the Brotherhood of Mansion Builders, asking for donations. This is interesting, a small detail but interesting. It turns out Lloyd Wright designed this plaque. It says, Anno Domini 1954, Preceptory of Light, Science and Mental Physics. He doesn't know whether to use a crucifix or a triangle. He's thinking about it. I think it ended up being the triangle. But what's really funny about this sign is like, wait a minute, where this is located, it's not near the Preceptory building at all. And I thought, what's going on here? And the Preceptory building is from 1960. It turns out that Dingle did this as kind of he wanted Lloyd Wright to finish it, and he was trying to visualize the building plan being done. So he thought if he had Lloyd Wright make the sign, and if he had a ceremony, the Preceptory of Light was originally supposed to be this large complex that Lloyd Wright was going to do with some of those more fantastical buildings, that it would get done. But it didn't get done. Lloyd Wright eventually left the project. So you have this sign here that actually tells an interesting story about this sort of very idealistic thinking that didn't happen. I love this, but the wind recently blew it open, and so now it's all cleaned up, which is great. But up until just a few months ago, this was from 1972. It still said Reverend Edwin J. Dingle in it. But it looks great now too. But this is what's really important here. It's not even near the building that gets known as the Preceptory building, which is done by this guy. So Lloyd Wright's gone. Dingle can't afford him, so he hires Orrin Kenneth Earl Jr. And this guy's a builder. He's not a name architect. He's about building things, doing a lot of things. He's known for tilt-up concrete. He's fast. He has good architects working for him, and he just knocks out the other buildings in a quicker and less expensive. So, but they're nicely done examples of what we call post-war modern expressionism or mid-century modernism. Expressionism in the sense of having a form that's really, really distinctive, not your box. But the materials on this are not the lavish ones that we see in something like the Caravansary. The money's not there. But he does this remarkable building with this spire here. His architect on this is a man named Lloyd Steffgen, who I don't know, and Ivo Cleric. Neither one of them come up that much. There's the building. It's a nice building. There's actually a really well-known Saarinen church by Eero Saarinen in Columbus, Indiana, and a lot of people thought, I can't remember the name of it, but if you're from the Midwest, you may see a lot of buildings that look like this, and a lot of people said, well, it's copying the Saarinen church. Saarinen's a famous architect in Columbus, Indiana. Well, this was designed 2 years before that church, and it's very identical to it in a lot of ways. But a lot of more typical 50s elements here. Flagstone, these sort of Regency doors, an oversized A-frame. Very, very telling of a mid-century modernism that in Southern California is probably a little more familiar with those expressionist modern elements. And that was finished about 1957. I love this. This is a souvenir record you could play with the church, the people, play it at 33 speed. He's always marketing himself. Fantastic record. And then the Preceptory of Light is done. I love how it's our Preceptory of Light in concrete as you enter. This is done by Ivo Cleric and probably a man named Harold Zook, who we'll talk about in a minute. Very, very just typical mid-century modernism with these mid-century modernism is kind of a less rigid form of modernism. You could have a little more play with something verging on ornamental, a little more fun. So you have these knife edges, these zigzags. He's using a sort of ornamental handling of the concrete masonry unit. globes, globe lights. So but it's all very, this is the kind of architecture that's also very familiar in Southern California. You know, and it's amazing that this work is intact. There's the inside of it, in some ways very straightforward, but still very intact from the late 50s, when 1959, when this was done, with the red triangles that are very important to Dingle. This looks a lot like the lamp on the lamplighter cover. I kind of wonder if it's the exact same lamp that Dingle had that whole time. And then Inspiration Heights. This is done by an architect working under OK Earl named Harold Zook. And those of you from Pasadena may be familiar with Zook. And these are meant to be meditation buildings, but they were also meant to be where certain older folks could live. It's hard to tell if Dingle wanted it to be a rest home or a meditation chamber or kind of both. But they too borrow from some elements of organic architecture. They're really long, low, hugging the ground. We see that with post-war ranch architecture in general. And here's some of the buildings here. This wonderful zigzagging brickwork. These long, low-slung roofs with these extended beams. Zook called this the contemporary style, or it's often known as the contemporary ranch style. Here's a couple of houses he did in Pasadena in the contemporary ranch style. He did the Saga Hotel, for those of you from Pasadena, along Colorado. Long, low-slung. He's open to using materials like T111, or back then it was known as K111, a very sort of inexpensive siding, but a modernist material. Double glazed glass, that was a recently new on the market. And almost like a very modernist ranch house. Some of you may be familiar with Eichler homes. Those are also what's known as the contemporary style. But Zook has a whole practice in Pasadena doing works in it. You can see the decorative concrete masonry units here at the Saga. Some of I don't have a picture of the planters, but they're very similar to the ones here at Mental Physics. But very, very, of the era. He was a little low on work, so he picked up some work with OK Earl and did this. There's an oral history on him. And then we get to this building here by Arthurs Damrose, and it's spelled D-A-M-R-O-S-E, or the original spelling is D-A-M-R-O-Z-E. Damrose is Latvian. He did not do too much work in Southern California. But one of the works he did work on is he worked at Disneyland with Walt Disney. And my understanding is that he worked on the Monsanto Voyage to Inner Space. Right. So if any of you remember Becoming a Molecule, you may be able to thank Mr. Damrose for that. Mr. Damrose worked for the Aero Saarinen office. Apparently he worked on the General Motors technical facility, if you're familiar with that. And he was a mental physics practitioner, or he at least knew Dingle. They knew each other. He was aware of him. This was not a planned building. This is the last building made here. This was made, Dingle's son, Richard Lampier Dingle, died here in 1959. He died from Legionnaire's disease. He was cleaning out an air conditioner before or after a convention. I think it was right before. And this is a plaque for Richard Dingle, and this is the Richard Lampier Dingle Memorial Chapel. And this is meant as a place for meditation. It's kind of a nice sort of like personal work that it was done by a mental physics practitioner for Dingle's own son, who apparently was supposed to take over for his dad when Ding Le Mei stepped down. Damrose used the triangle because he knew that it had symbolism for Dingle, and uses it inside on the plaque. There's the inside of it. This painting, that painting on the left is there in the early images. So it's a fantastic space. One of my favorites here, these are folded plate lights. These are places to pray or meditate. They're almost like confessionals. You can kneel. There's a rope with a curtain and purple carpeting. Just very, very, just of another era, but meant to be a place of sort of solitude, contemplation. Meditation, you can see there's pillows there. So Dingle, and by the 1960s, his son had passed away, but he kept going for a while. He would, about 1966 or 1968, he lived on 101 South Highland, I believe, in Hollywood, and he moves out here. He moves into the administration building. It becomes his house, and this is kind of where he spends the last years of his life. He stops practice about 1968. He's really slowing things down by then. And then on January 27th, 1972, Dingle passes away after a brief illness. The period of significance, when we landmark something, we have to ascribe what's called a period of significance. So it has to be a past chapter with definite dates in which something was significant. The period of significance for this property starts at 1941 when it's consecrated, and it ends at 1972 when Dingle passes away. Because we're finding it eligible for its associations with Dingle, its architecture, and really for what Dingle contributed to this culture in Southern California that allows for sort of an integrated East-West, the possibility of yoga, breathing exercises, esoteric teachings, a lot of what, gets known as New Age thought, but what a lot of people practice now. I think it's very fascinating that so many people who are moving up to Joshua Tree right now are so into a lot of these things, like diet, vegetarian diet, meditation, breathing, yet they don't know what this property is, or that this is one of the very first places directly associated with that. It's right there. This is a multi-use room where he could give talks, but the more overtly spiritual buildings around the other side of the campus, they were the first sanctuary of mystic Christianity, the meditation chapel, the preceptory building. Those were where the teachings were, those were just geared toward teachings and spiritualism. This was kind of geared, there were teachings and breathing exercises and everything that took place in here, but this was also kind of like, I don't want to be a little bit blunt, but it's almost like a mental physics timeshare a little bit. Like people would come out here and have fun, and there was a pool, or there was supposed to be, the pool was made later. This was meant to be close to nature, ride horses. There were these lodges in here. This was a multi-purpose room, primarily for teaching. We'll walk around and look at a couple things. When we talk about organic architecture, one thing you'll notice about this building, if we step over here maybe, let's go and look at the building from a little bit of a distance. If we take the building in, if we take the building in, so if you stand where I'm standing, you realize that this hill that this building on is sloping down, and the building slopes down with the hill. This is a very, very hard building to take pictures of, by the way, because it's very long, but it's sloping down with the hill. So it's long, it's low, and it's hugging the ground. And a lot of the color, and also there's two types of stone here. If you look at the fence, it's more of like an orange brown. If you look at the walls, it's orange brown, but the pylons and the fins are more of a salmon pink and a light orange. It's two-tone when you look closely, and it seems to have been a way to kind of dematerialize the building, to make it seem a little more, I don't know, like a little more lightweight. You don't have dark all over the place. The pylons and the fins, which we'll see when we walk around the building, are of a different color. I love the concrete in this is a nice rich gold colored concrete. Some of these stones are definitely cut a certain way. Those long stones under the sign that says French Apollo, they did not come out of the ground like that. There's purposeful cuts to some of these. There's a very subtle sense of composition, of arrangement. It's not just like throwing the stones in the concrete and seeing, it seems to have been deliberate. Let's go this way. We won't stay out here too long. We'll just walk around the building real quick. There's this kind of what Lloyd Wright did these on some other houses in LA. These, I believe, are called battlements. It's almost like a fortress. or a fortified compound. Again, it almost seems like a stage set. And knowing Ding Le Mei was interested in Tibet and points east, this looks a little bit like a Tibetan, like something you would see in a Tibetan monastery, if you've ever seen a picture of a Tibetan monastery with this kind of pylon form. It's very solid. And then this is used for water drainage, but in those Tibetan monasteries, you have wood beams coming out. So there's like a subtle shout out to a Tibetan monastery with this element here. I think this is really striking up here as it is, but originally that's where the tule mat was. And again, try to imagine a tule mat up there that's thick and that's all purple and aquamarine blue triangles, purple and blue. You never see purple and blue on a roof of a building, and I think it's a shame. And it would go so good with the orange. So it would go so good with these colors. It would be orange, blue, and purple building, basically. So we're gonna walk over here. There's all these little vignettes at Mental Physics that are quite wonderful to explore. These are old parks, there's pocket parks all over the place on this property. You could start to see some of the fins now. And this is all lodging. Each of these is a room. So this is each its own, I think each is a duplex actually, each of these bays. And those fins, if you're inside a room, those fins become the fireplace inside the room of that same stone, and they extend out the other side to become the patio. So we'll walk this way. What I want to do is we're going to walk around the building, and then we're going to do this to the U. And there's a really, really striking photogenic view of the building from the other side. And so the building is an L, and you can see it's not a perfectly right-angled L either. It's kind of at a funny little angle here, no right angles. Everything's at a sort of cant. For those of you who are familiar with 1950s coffee shop architecture, a lot of Googie borrows from a lot of this too. You would have a lot of like stonework in buildings like Pan's Coffee Shop, for example. And also, if you have not checked out the cafeteria yet, that is one of among other things, to have a 1955 Lloyd Wright restaurant, it was one of the most intact 50s coffee shops in all of Southern California. It is so intact. So let's walk this way. You can see here the dark stone. Again, the stone here is really, really dark, and you can see how much darker this stone is. And then if you look at the pylons, they're all the lighter stone right there. And again, that is not a classical pylon. It's not a typical vertical. They wanted to Lloyd Wright, father and son, wanted to stay away from anything like a thin pipe column. Modernists in the 40s and 50s were doing pipe they were called pilates. Corbusier did them. This is the antithesis of that. So a lot of what's here is kind of like in your face to European modernism. Frank Lloyd Wright wanted something very much of the land, and his son wanted something very much of the land, very much of Frank Lloyd Wright Sr. did not want to copy anything from another place. He was interested in something original that could be an architecture for, the Midwest originally, and then when he went to Arizona, what the son kind of does here, the father did first in Arizona as well. So we're going to go this way. This is the maintenance area that I mentioned. So this was all the sort of the back of the house stuff over here. There's the cottages. And if we come this way, we're gonna walk on this trail a little bit. You could really, really see the fins here, and you could see how from over here, the fins sort of divide each unit, so you get some privacy in these various units here. You have the very solid wall. This wall, again, the coloration of this wall, look at the color of the concrete in that wall. It's gold. It's the exact same color as the dirt below it. It's the same tonality, and that's intentional. Let's just walk over here. And so here's your cottages. And you can see how they seem very integrated into their environment. There's the back of the house area. And everything is kind of at a funny angle. These fins don't
juts straight out. They kind of jut out diagonally. The rooms have a lot of hexagonal spaces in them, a lot of triangular lights. Everything's a triangle or a hexagon here. And I just wanted to bring you over here. I think this is a really, really striking view. See where I'm standing? From right here, you could see the sunlight's hitting these fins really nice. You get this other sort of, this really, really tall battlement element here of the wall. And this is kind of like I think one of the very good shots of this building, which is, part of the reason why I wanted you to see it. And it seems to be just, the building just keeps extending to its land. And the cafeteria does this too. The cottages do it also. It's almost like it keeps wanting to extend out. It keeps wanting to extrude along the land, and stretch. Everything is just stretching out, hugging the ground. The pool, there was going to be a hexagonal shaped pool over there that was never made, but there's a triangular fountain. If you come over here, we'll just circle the building, what the hell. So if you come over here, one thing that I thought was really interesting, when you talk about like capturing ephemeral features, a feature that I was really fascinated by here, which caught me off guard, was there's a laundry line here. And I thought, if you see it over there, see the metal laundry line? And I thought, what's a laundry line doing here? And I realized that this was meant as originally it was meant as a new city, and people would need to do laundry. And this was really meant as a people to get away for long periods of time. They were meant to stay here for days, for maybe a couple weeks. So you had a dedicated laundry room in the bottom of this building, and then you have this like 1947 laundry line that has somehow still survived after all of this time. This laundry line is still there. So it's not about what's always pretty. Sometimes it's about what's telling, what tells the story of the property. And the laundry line tells the story. It does a really good job of telling the story of the property, because it tells this story about people who came here, people who kind of, were meant to get away from, the rest of the world for a while, stay here day in and day out, do their wash and hang it on the laundry line. It just makes no sense that there's a laundry line here at all. But when you understand the context of what the building was for and what the property was for, suddenly the laundry line kind of makes sense. And it's like, oh, okay. So something like this is a character, what we would call in the National Register nomination, a character defining feature. And I did call this out as a character defining feature because it helps tell the story in a very unique, ephemeral way of what happened here. So something like this becomes really important for the nomination. It's not the primary character defining feature, but it has some importance, and it tells a story, and it's one of those things that's easily missed, and one of the things I was concerned about when I drafted this was not forgetting about something that's easily missed, that may seem kind of ugly on the surface, but could tell a story. So that became really, really important. The pool was originally supposed to be right here, but instead you have this triangular fountain. I don't think anybody ever swam in it. I don't think it's a jacuzzi. It's just a fountain. And when I mentioned the parking area with those triangular planters, the Italian cypress trees were supposed to do this. And again, imagine driving along the road and seeing like 13 of those triangles. There's 13, I don't know why he picked that number, kind of interesting or auspicious, with the delta formation of cypress trees over here. A lot of Ding Le Mei in some of his literature talked about this view of the building and saying again it looked very Tibetan or very much like a temple that you would see in the Far East, and you got to imagine that stucco wall is later. So this is also very, again, probably a shout out to Dingle's interest in Eastern esoteric temples. Lloyd Wright Jr. did his homework, and he's like, well, these are what a lot of these temples look like, and so he's kind of giving a little shout out to this here. It's very stage setty. It almost looks like you could have it as a set piece for some film, and he was doing it on other works as well. Anyway, I just thought I'd point out a couple of features about this. Yes, question?
Well, it's also too, but his father, Frank Lloyd Wright, borrowed a lot from Mesoamerican architecture.
Yeah.
A lot of things he did was the Mayan and pre-Columbian architecture.
Absolutely.
Battered walls and the slopes.
Absolutely, good. Yeah, absolutely. And this is, you know, Frank, you were mentioning that Frank Lloyd Wright borrowed a lot from the Mayan. Frank Lloyd Wright had a bunch of houses in LA that are Mayan revival houses. The Ennis Brown house and all his concrete block stuff in LA is, you know, it's almost like most of it's a shout out to the Mayans in one form or another. And some of that makes it, you know, some of that probably does make its way here. This does look like Mayan architecture also. From what I understand, the intent was to reference the East though, because Dingle was so into the East.
Right.
Where did Ding Le Mei have his apartments or his house, and does it still stand?
Yes, the house is still there. It was originally called the Administration Building, and it's about 500 feet east of this building over there. And so that's where he spent the last years of his life. When he was, most of the time he was running this, he was in Hollywood off Highland. So, but the last years of his life were spent, and that's a nice building too. It's like a smaller version of this. Yeah. And I'm sure you can go over, and that's where the incinerator came from.
As far as landscaping and plants, there's oleanders everywhere, and they're like hugely overgrown at this time. Like, was that originally in this?
Yes,
mix,
Lloyd Wright has all the landscape specs, and the oleanders were Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
As were a lot of other plants that are long gone. So Lloyd Wright, you know, he had a passion for landscape architecture. He studied with the Olmsted brothers, and who were America's preeminent landscape architects. And he laid out all the plants here. I mean, the Joshua trees, of course, pre-existed. And there's probably a lot of other things here now that he didn't put, but they've just kind of ended up here or grown here. But he did do the original landscape design.
Yeah, because now I see, like, on a lot of the older, like, really 50s architecture, the landscaping that was original is overgrown, where, you know, looked beautiful.
Yeah,
Structural,
looked beautiful. It made more sense. And also before water problems,
Right.
you know, this used to have all its own wells that were functioning. So imagine this more irrigated. What other plants would still be here from 1950s? Yeah, so that was all Lloyd Wright too.
In '72, did they sell the produce, or was it just for on the property?
Oh no, I don't know what I think they just gave it to whoever wanted it. I mean, I don't think they were growing so much to sell it, but they gave it to whoever was here. So in '72, so I didn't mention this in the talk, after he dies, Mental Physics holds on to it, and they still own it now. I mean, it's still the Institute of Mental Physics to this day. There were other people after Dingle, you know, but it's hard to keep that energy going the whole time. It kind of went through like a wane. And it seems to just now starting to be coming back up, you know, with a sort of resurgence and a lot of interest in, you know, some of the old original teachers. They were at the talk. I don't see them here, but they were sitting in there, and they've been coming for 50 years, and quite special people. But they're the ones who told me that they were growing crops there through the early 80s, and they were doing great. And the farm, by the way, you can't really see it, but it's that direction behind this sort of ridge. It's back in that corner. It's still there.
Your description of the Italian cypresses, they were inside the triangle, right?
Yes, they were inside the triangle there, but here they're outside. So in the parking lot, in the parking triangles, they were inside at each corner.
So is there any pictures of construction while it's going on? I'm just curious how they did the rock. Did they do forms and push the rocks in and fill it with concrete, or was it?
That's probably pretty easy. I don't know, but that's probably pretty easy to find out because he did exactly what Frank Lloyd Wright Sr. did, and there's a lot of scholarship on him.
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of scholarship on Lloyd Wright Jr. too, and it's probably, I just didn't go into it in such great detail for the nomination. But
Do you know what his interactions were with the local community at the time when it was being built?
Dingle?
There probably wasn't much here.
There was not a lot here at all. The road was just newly put in, and this was considered like no man's land. There was the military base that went in. Actually, this went in right at the same time as I think the military base went in World War II, or 29 Palms. So
They
it's
did all their desert training out there.
yeah, they did all the desert during the war. So this starts in 1941, right as that road was just laid, I think, for the bait. Like that road was fresh. The moment that road is laid, he buys this. He thinks things through. He's smart.
How many acres is the total property?
The total nomination's 156.
Acres.
So who did, because it was the Homestead Act was going on, the Small Tract Act was going around that time, around 30s, right?
Yeah.
to the 50s, and so how could he buy like a large tract of land when they were kind of doing this parcel?
I think this belonged, that's a good question. I think this belonged to a rancher.
Okay, so
And they sold it, he bought it as big parcel. So, you know, there was a lot of Homestead Act stuff going on, but that doesn't mean that there weren't big things available too.